Eric.
Cue up our next question.
Hi, this is Melissa VonderHarr from TradeWorks from IC Store Innovations and chair of the CSP C-Store Cannabis Board. And with the two of you being some of the most foremost experts in the cannabis space and talking about the many problems that exist here, I'd like to know if you had one wish from a magic genie that would help fix regulations to make it easier for cannabis businesses to thrive and expedite the normalization of cannabis in the United States, what would you wish for? And just to make it interesting, you cannot wish for the government to have never made cannabis illegal in the first place. What could we do today that would help fix this mess?
Yeah, Melissa, it is a mess. You're right. That's not a lie. I had to think about this one a lot, and I'm just going to go for it. And I'm going to say that if I had one genie in the bottle, it would be full federal descheduling and legalization paired with a national regulatory framework that sets clear and fair rules about how cannabis can be grown, sold, marketed, and moved across state lines. I want to, within that context, honor what I think is the importance of the dispensary pioneers, because I think that as we think about what normalization looks like, we also need to be intentional about the people who have really jumped through the flaming hoops to create this market. So really, when I think about that genie and what that full-scale model looks like is a tiered retail vision. And I think that licensed dispensaries should continue to exist for inhalable high-potency products. And I also think they should be allowed to co-locate with other businesses. And then I would want to include conventional retail into the mix. Think bodegas, health stores, grocery store chains that would be allowed to sell low-dose edibles and beverages, topicals, and wellness stuff. Really like bringing cannabis into everyday life where consumers are. And then e-commerce. I would want that to exist too, because we're talking about the genie in the bottle. And it's 2025 and everything is online. So cannabis should be no different. Yeah.
You'll be all in.
All in.
Said, all right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to approach this question a little bit more from a nuanced perspective, understanding the world that we're operating in right now.
Not the genie, like the reality.
Well, it's like a genie with today's baseline.
Okay, great.
Right?
Good.
So like we have to.
The full spectrum.
We need achievements.
A step along the way.
Yeah. Before I get there, I would like to say, I know the question is positioned at commercialization, all that kind of stuff, but I think it's really important that we don't lose the narrative of like, we need to decriminalize, deschedule, and get the tens of thousands of nonviolent criminals out of jail,
Yes.
right? Like, so that's my first wish. Second wish, understanding the current landscape, is we need Congress to identify cannabinoids in the FDCNA as its own unique category. So we can stop having a discussion about whether it fits into supplements or as a food additive or anything. They're cannabinoids, they deserve their own regulatory path. And that allows us to start creating the rules that allow us to then determine whether it goes to the TTB or otherwise. And so that's step one. The next step after that is, what do we do with hemp and cannabis? You know, obviously calling it one plant, making sure that it's legal everywhere and getting interstate commerce. That is the ultimate goal, but how do we get there? I think we have to survive with a bifurcated market for a little while, where we allow for interstate commerce through something like the States Act. So cannabis operators can ship from one state to the next, that we have this heavily regulated, hopefully not as heavily, but still regulated for the full suite of cannabis products, the hyper potencies, all that kind of stuff. And then we have the low dose category that is sold in the mainstream channels, anywhere alcohol, tobacco, and other adult substances are sold. So that's my midterm genie.
Folks, yeah, Ben just laid out like the actual genie in the bottle path instead of just jumping over all the steps to get there. I really like what you're talking about as it relates to the FDCNA and cannabinoid regulatory path. I wonder why you would keep a bifurcated hemp and cannabis reality
I mean,
within the open construct of what if we could do anything.
yeah, I don't know. I try to remain optimistic, but dealing with policy for the last several years has made me very pessimistic as far as what we can achieve in the legislature. But it's hard to imagine individual states giving up their stigmatized perspective of what cannabis is or what hemp is, and we need to preserve states' rights like throughout this path right here. And so when I think about the near-term solution, it's like we have to preserve what Tennessee has deemed as right for Tennessee and what Minnesota has deemed right for Minnesota, and I hate to say it, but what California has deemed right for California, right? And so in order to preserve that, we have to acknowledge that hemp and cannabis exist in two unique regulatory frameworks. But we need to frame them up better, right? Like we need better regulations for hemp. We need the federal government to provide for consumer safety, testing standards, labeling standards. Not overdo it. That's my big wish, and that's a big wish. That's a Genie-worthy wish, is to like not have the federal government overdo it when they implement regulations. But they need to kind of stop there and then pass it over to the states to determine how they want to regulate these products.
It's fun to think about, but it also kind of makes me feel crazy because the incremental progress that we've experienced as an industry and as a movement is the focal point, as opposed to these big dreams.
Right.
We aren't going after these things necessarily that you and I are talking about. We're instead kind of gaining inches. So I think we're going to keep gaining inches.
Yeah.
And I think there's a later question coming about maybe what 10 years looks like from now and who wins. So we'll touch on that a little bit later in the episode.